Dr. Riley Moynes, an extremely warm welcome to the Humans versus Retirement podcast.
Thank you, Dan. It is a pleasure to join you this morning.
It's an absolute pleasure for me, all the way from Toronto, where we're dialing in today. Notwithstanding a couple of technical hiccups that we've had this morning, Riley, getting on, but we're here and I can't wait for this conversation. You have recorded and delivered and talked about one of the most amazing topics of retirement that's now got almost 5 million views in terms of the TED Talk that you delivered. And you have generated a whole suite of resources for people thinking about their retirement based on that wonderful talk and your philosophy. So I can't wait to delve into the 4 phases of retirement that you've made very famous. But I'd love for you, Riley, just to give the listeners a bit of background about you, how you kind of got to working in the finance space quite late on in career, and what's, and how you really developed this 4 phases of retirement, and what made you want to step on stage and write about it and talk about it in such detail with such passion.
Well, I began my working career in public education as a teacher and later as an administrator. I spent the first 20 years of my working career in that field. And then I decided that if I took some of the skills that I had developed over that period of time and applied them perhaps in a different area, that might work as well. And I decided to leave the public education realm and to become involved in financial services. So I spent the next 20 years in financial services as an advisor, and founded a couple of companies that are now publicly traded here in Canada, one of the largest of the investment funds here now, and spent 20 years in that area. And then as I stepped back from that kind of thing, in retirement, became a little discombobulated, I think is the right term to use. I had done a fair amount of speaking and I had done a fair amount of writing both in both fields. So that was not a new area for me in particular. And so what I discovered with my own experience as a retiree was, as I say, being a little bit discombobulated. It wasn't kind of what I anticipated. And so what I did, which is what I usually do, is to go back to the original sources related to retirement planning. And of course, I discovered, as you know full well, that the heavy emphasis there is with respect to investments, to estate planning, to wills, powers of attorney, all that kind of stuff, which is critically important, of course, but it just isn't what I was looking for. So I decided, as I had done previously in some of the research, the best way to go about it was probably to interview people and to kind of get their views on it. So I began with a list of folks that I had been referred to as being people who had in some way or another figured out retirement, whatever that means. So I started there, and I had about dozen questions or so that I wanted to ask each of these folks. And I always finished up with the question, how do you squeeze all the juice out of retirement? That was my last fling at it. So one thing led to another. And of course, people said, well, no, you should also talk to so-and-so. They've got it figured out. Talk to so-and-so. And so it went on for about 3 years. And I interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens, well over 100 folks. And then I had this massive amount of information that I had to try to make sense of. And that's ultimately what led to the 4 phases of retirement. It just seemed kind of magically over time to kind of fit. Once I had created that framework of the 4 phases, I wanted, of course, to test it back with some of the people that I had interviewed. And without exception, I'm happy to say that people said that framework worked for them perfectly. It represented their retirement journey. And so from there, I wrote a book on the same title, The 4 Phases of Retirement, What to Expect When You Retire. It has become very popular in North America, for which I'm very grateful. And then the opportunity was presented for the TED Talk. Well, of course, I knew about TED, and I knew of the brand, and I knew of the quality that was expected there. And I thought that it would be an interesting challenge just to go through the process of preparing and qualifying and competing. So long story short, in that regard, I was selected, and back in 2022 in Vancouver, delivered the TED Talk, which then required 5 or 6 months for it to be edited and so on. And when it was finally released, of course, having done all the work that you've done, you have no idea what the reaction will be. It could it could fall like a stone, and I was again very gratified and humbled by the response that we've had. And so, as I indicated to you recently, we've now surpassed 4.8 million views, which tells me that this topic is one of widespread interest.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, we're very much cut from the same cloth in terms of, working with individuals at this phase of life. And I think realizing pretty early on, and you've realized it through your own journey, which is phenomenal in terms of delivering your own experiences to this, but realizing that this is, as I've put, retirement is more of a human problem than a maths problem. Retirement is a complex human problem, not a complicated maths problem. A lot of people get those two very confused.
Absolutely.
And I think that what's really interesting for me when you listen to the opening of your TED Talk, when you talk about there are 10,000 Americans, and the same in this side of the pond, not the same numbers, but the same kind of the same kind of ratio, etc. But 10,000 Americans retiring every day for the next 10 or 15 years. This retirement tsunami, as you put it, which is fascinating. And I think it leads me to say, look, this message has obviously resonated with millions. The stats back that up. What made that message? Why do you think that message was so impactful for millions? And without putting words in your mouth, is it because that people are kind of head in the sand when it comes to the hard kind of human work that needs to be done when it comes to retirement, and they're just thirsty for this information because it's not out there? You mentioned the TED Talkers, right? You Google this stuff and it's mostly about the numbers. There's not huge amounts sitting out there about the transition that people make.
Well, I think that the financial services industry is largely responsible for this head in the sand kind of thing, if I may be blunt about it. Most
I agree, by the way.
financial advisors are frankly not very interested in the human side of it, the psychological changes and challenges that their clients are going to face. They're more attuned, they're more numbers folks for the most part. And they love to discuss, portfolios and this and that. And again, it's critically important, but it's not the full package. And I feel that what has happened, starting to happen, is that people are understanding, and those particularly who are in retirement are realizing that there's much more to it than they have been prepared for, and that there has been very little attention paid to the predictable psychological changes and challenges that people will almost invariably encounter in retirement. And that, I believe, is probably the single main reason for the wide reception that we've enjoyed with that TED Talk.
Riley, it's really interesting you say that, because what's definitely happened with the work that I do on a one-to-one basis with clients, and obviously them potentially listening to the work that I do from an educational perspective on the podcast and my blogs and my sketches and my writing, is that they're coming to me now with a kind of a human first, money second mindset. I think they're 2-3 years away from retirement. They've done a bit of research, and actually what they're going is, I don't actually want a traditional or need a traditional financial advisor. The money thing is, not necessarily sorted. There's some things we need to do, but I actually now realize that I need help with, holistic help with the transition.
Yes.
And thinking about all those other stuff. And knowing that money is one of the big emotional lightning rods that kind of that do attach a lot of these things, when we're leaving work and all that stuff. So they want someone to look up. But it's really interesting how people are coming to me with that mindset first. It's like, I need this alongside the money. I need and want this kind of work, which I think is a huge transition.
That's a very significant transition, I think, Dan, and it's one that I think is long overdue. And I think that the real value add that advisors like yourself can provide for clients is an understanding that there is so much more to it than just the financial and the numbers. And I think it's going to be a growing trend. I hope it certainly will be. As I think back to my experience with many of the clients that I worked with, I realize now that I probably did not provide them the breadth of preparation that they could have and probably ideally should have been received, because I just wasn't aware at the time. It wasn't until it happened to me that it all of a sudden struck me and thought that, well, maybe I can help others.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's really interesting. There's a lot of people now that have gone through it themselves that are coming out the other side, and they're not necessarily people that have been financial advisors. I look at a good friend of mine, Fritz Gilbert, who writes the Retirement Manifesto, one of the kind of most read retirement blogs in the world. This is a guy that just went through retirement and had a tough time and started writing about it. And people are more interested in reading his blogs than they are a financial advisor's blogs, right? Because that's the stuff that's really challenging. So I want to pick up on something actually outside of what we've said. You've mentioned something there, how kind of maybe inevitable this journey is, right? And before we get into the depths and reveal those 4 phases, I'm sure many of the listeners have listened to your TED talk, but before we kind of reveal those 4 phases, I mean, do you think this journey is inevitable? Like, is it that everybody to a bigger or lesser degree will go through the 4 phases, and this is not kind of like, I'll put a load of work in and you can skip phases 2 and 3 and go from phase 1 to phase 4? It seems to me as if this is a pattern that most people will actually go through and have to understand. And if they understand they're going to go through it beforehand, you can equip yourself before that, knowing that you're going to hit that particular phase and these are the emotions that are going to go with it.
Exactly. I believe that the 4 phases are predictable for probably 80% of retirees. I believe that there are 2 groups that I have discovered in my research that do seem to be able to avoid phases 2 and 3. Are number 1, they are entrepreneurs. These are people who have done what they generally love to do for a long time and have no reason to stop doing it. What they are probably trying to do is to do less of it as they prepare for perhaps someone else to take over that business, whether it be family or whether it be someone else who's been designated. That's one group. So they know exactly what they love to do. They're going to do it as long as they possibly can, but perhaps at a more reduced level of intensity. The second group of people that I have found, and again, the total of these 2 probably represents maximum 20% of retirees. But that second group are people who have, during their domestic or working careers, have identified some kind of passion, some kind of hobby that they have done throughout their lives generally, whether it's teaching art, whether it is coaching, whatever it might be, whether it's photography. Again, it doesn't matter what it is, but I found that group of people can't wait to do more of that than they've had the opportunity to do for many, many years. So they are the only 2 groups that I've been able to identify who have the potential and the likelihood, frankly, of going from phase 1 to phase 4.
Yeah, makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If you think of the people that continue to work in that environment for a whole host of time. You think of maybe sportsmen that end up coaching and,
yes,
they stay in that field and it's kind of, they're there till they're 70 and 80 and, that kind of thing. I get that. Yeah. So I'm intrigued. Now we've got more than 18 minutes, which is wonderful. So we can kind of delve a little bit deeper into this. You had a limited amount of time, and obviously you do this, and we'll put links to the book and the workshops that you deliver as well, which go into these in more detail in the show notes. So let's dive into the 4 phases and get into the meat of this conversation. So I won't steal your thunder. If you tell me what those 4 phases are, and then we'll pick each one off bit by bit, and then decide, and then talk about, really what it is, what it means, what are the things to look out for, and kind of, I suppose, why retirees go through that particular journey.
Well, big picture wise, then, so we begin with phase one, which I refer to as the vacation phase. That's exactly what it's like. You have no set routine for the time being. You're happy to be able to get up when you want, go to bed when you want, do what you want, with whom you want, where you want. It's just like being on vacation. And it's the kind of thing that most people have been told represents the ideal of retirement. And that's unfortunate. They're viewed, when you look at commercials and when you look at newspapers and when you look at magazines, they portray education, they portray the vacation phase as cavorting along the beach with a loved one with a glass of wine in hand. You're somewhere warm, you're somewhere beachy, as I say. And that's the way retirement has been sold. And that's what people expect retirement to be. And it's a wonderful time when we're on vacation. But what I've discovered and what many others have discovered is that within a year or two, too much of a good thing is just too much. And we actually get bored. And we need a routine. We miss our routine. And we ask ourselves questions like, is that all there is to retirement? That's not what I was told it was going to be about. And when we reach that phase, that stage, or that time period, as I say, typically between 1 and 2 years for most people, for me it was two, just about dead on, we become kind of disenchanted. And that's when we enter phase two, which is when we feel loss and we feel lost. We lose 5 significant elements in our lives that are all directly related to retirement in phase two. We lose that routine. And while for a while we're happy about that, I believe that we're genetically wired such that over the long term we need a routine. We want it. It's important to us. And we miss that in phase two. We have lost our identity because many people identify with the work that they do and they take it very seriously. When we walk away, we lose a part of ourselves. We lose, thirdly, some of the relationships that we had established over a domestic or working career. And although we don't necessarily lose all of them, we lose a significant number of those relationships when we walk away for the last time. We lose a sense of power, a sense of power. Yes, some people lose a sense of power because over a period of time, they've acquired some responsibility, perhaps for personnel or budgets, whatever it may be. But when we walk away for the last time, we're just a guy or a gal in the street and nobody cares. And again, fifthly, we lose a sense of purpose because, again, it's tied to our identity. Many of us take a lot of sense of real purpose in what we do. And when we walk away, we lose that element. Those are all directly related to retirement. Those 5 losses. Almost everybody experiences them, and we don't see them coming, and we lose them all virtually simultaneously. And it can be like, damn, it's traumatic. And what makes it even worse, Dan, is that at that time as well, in phase two, we have to deal with what I call the 3Ds. These are not directly related to retirement per se, but more to a time of life. But that time of life often overlaps with retirement. So the first D is decline, like physical decline. That silky smooth golf swing that we may have had at one point all of a sudden isn't so silky smooth anymore. Then there's the mental decline that we experience as where we forget things. We've forgotten where things are. And, honey, where's my cell phone? I'm sure I left it here and I didn't. Then there is depression. And the world famous Mayo Clinic indicates through their research that when you retire, there is a 40% likelihood that you will display elements of clinical depression. That's significant, laid on top of the other losses that are directly related to retirement. And then finally, there's an elevated level of divorce at this time of life. Divorces for those people over 60 have doubled since 1990. And for those over 65, it has tripled since 1990. So when you pile those 5 losses associated directly with retirement, add on the 3Ds, you can see why phase 2 is a very difficult time for many, many people. We suffer loss and we feel lost. Thirdly, thankfully, most people at some point will say to themselves or to a loved one, significant other, hey, I can't go on like this. I don't want to spend the rest of my life, conceivably 30 years, possibly 1/3 of my life, feeling like this. I can't do it. I've got to do something about it. And that's the good news. That's when people start to move into phase 3, which is the phase that I referred to as the time where we trial and error. And so we need to try things. We need to do things. We need to do things that make us want to get up in the morning again, that make us feel that we can still contribute. And what I've discovered in phase 3 is that it is a trial and error thing, that it's highly unlikely that the first bright idea that you come up with is going to be the one that propels you forward to phase 4. It probably isn't. For me, it was a dozen failures, a dozen initiatives that I took, hoping that that would be the thing that would help me get out of this funk. And they didn't, for the most part. They didn't until I finally twigged to the right thing. But it's critically important that even though you might not be successful in these trials initially, you've got to keep at it, because the alternative is slipping back to phase 2 and becoming a statistic. And that's even worse. Finally, there is a group of people that I believe to be only about 60 to 65% of retirees who reach phase 4, where we reinvent and rewire. But there's work involved in that. And to come back to one of your comments earlier, Dan, a lot of people feel that they have worked hard during their working career or their domestic career, and now in retirement they can coast. And that's not true. It requires work, and it requires introspection, which is not something that we as humans are particularly good at all the time. But it involves asking tough questions like, why am I here? What's the purpose of my being here? And I believe that there are tools that people can use in order to help answer those questions. Number one, I think it's critically important that people identify their unique ability. And I refer to a unique ability as something or some things that you love to do and you know darn well that you do exceedingly well. That or those things represent your unique ability. We've all got something like that, but most of us could not identify it if we were asked to. And then if we ask people, what is your unique ability? And I do it in my workshops, people don't know. And so it's important that they have an opportunity to identify those things. Secondly, I ask people to combine that and look at in their lives to date. Let me know, write down 5 wins, 5 victories, 5 significant wins for you. And people often don't think about that. They could probably do much more than that, many more than that, but they don't think about that. And then I suggest that they look at the comparison. And I suggest to them that the things that you love to do and do exceedingly well have probably led to those successes in your life. And that what we need to do now is to take those strengths and take those victories and maybe apply them in some new area in phase 4 of your life, because that's where you need to reinvent and rewire. And if there's one distinguishing characteristic that I have found over and over again that separates phase 4 people from every other of those phases, it is service to others. They always are in some way or another providing service to others. Maybe they're being paid for it. I interviewed one fella who delivers pizzas on Friday nights between 4 and 7 p.m. only. He gets a little bit of money for it, but he gets great joy out of the fact that he delivers something hot and delicious that people can't wait to get at their front door. And it gives him tremendous satisfaction. It's a simple kind of a thing, but it just gives him joy. And he's reinventing and rewiring. But the underlying theme is service to others. That's what makes phase 4 people phase 4 people.
I've got so much to unpack here, Riley, with you. So much. We might need 4 episodes to do this, right? So, but we're going to give it a shot, and I might have to get you back to do this. But so fascinating, and a journey that I see, a journey that I like witness, and I'm, that all the time with clients, and so let's go back to the start. Let's go back to phase 1. And actually, a couple of things for me here is, and there's some not famous. There's a lot of noise out there, quite rightly so. I like the noise about retirement shock, and I think this kind of, to me, the emotions that hit in phase 1, the vacation phase, are a little bit shock and elation. And as you rightly said, I think if you look on 90% of financial advisor websites that deal with retirees, they predominantly talk that the website will show pictorially and word-wise all about the vacation phase. This is walking hand in hand on the beach. This is having lots of fun. This is sipping wine, as you've talked about. And I think this is what people, as you've said, believe the only phase of retirement is. There's one phase, and it's the vacation phase.
That's right.
And I think the problem, as you've quite rightly said, is that wears out. I love my golf. I know you do as well. I play lots of golf. I'm half decent at it. But if I played it 4 times a week and it was the thing that I did, I don't think it would work for much more than probably a month. And so I think that bit is really, really important. So obviously, many retirees start their journey. They feel excited. There's a little bit of shock, but then I think they get this real pickup, don't they, in emotions, elation, and they feel excited about what they're going to do. They're free, never-ending vacation, as you've said. What is, I suppose, some of that early work, pre-vacation, a bit like when we plan a holiday, right? And I think I've said on this podcast before, a lot of people spend more time planning a 2-week holiday or vacation than they do a 30-year retirement. What is some of that kind of pre-planning work that people could really think about in order to maybe not completely get over the honeymoon phase or the vacation phase, but understand and maybe shorten the time frame that you're at the end of phase 1?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. What I have discovered is that the just plain awareness of the 4 phases has proven to be helpful for pre-retirees, because again, they anticipated it to be something like what I call phase 1. They don't have a name for it, but that's what they're thinking. And so I have found that it's very helpful to alert pre-retirees to the fact that there are likely going to be a range of different emotions that they feel, and that they're just being aware of those 4 phases. It's kind of like being forewarned is forearmed. And so I think that has been helpful for people in the past. The other thing that I find helpful for pre-retirees is, again, to give thought to what is their unique ability, what have been some successes in the past. Because most people, in my experience, don't think about that until they are retired. If you can be alert to those things before you're retired, it will give you a way of looking at retirement that is different than most people experience, and it will encourage them to look for opportunities where they can use their skills and abilities and have led to success in the past, and maybe apply them in a different situation. So again, it's kind of forewarned is forearmed.
Yeah, I think awareness is the key word there, Riley. For me, like, emotional awareness is important, right? I think, emotions are there for everyone to see, but I think true adaptation, true flexibility comes from awareness, right? That kind of, I know it's coming, or I know why I'm feeling it, and here's a bit of a playbook to kind of feel like I can work through it. And actually, thinking about the holiday analogy again, I mean, a lot of people enter into retirement a bit like going on holiday, but they actually haven't packed anything. They just arrive at the airport and they think, well, what I'll do, I'll go round the shops and I'll buy some bits and then I'll figure out where I'm going. But actually, I've just booked a flight to Mexico and I've bought all kind of like hiking, like rain gear. Like, you know what I mean? It's like that. You just wouldn't do that, would you? You would plan where you're going first and do everything that, in that order. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's definitely the phase that everybody believes retirement is. So going into phase 2, this phase really intrigues me because I've written a lot about the same subjects as you, because like you, I've identified that purpose, identity, and relationships are core to humans thriving and being happy, but also core in terms of what work provides us, right? Work provides us with identity and purpose and relationships. I've also the other two that I've put in there as well is time and spending with freedom. So I think, one of the other big things that people often don't appreciate or plan very well is their time. And they have a very, very hard time switching from a savings habit to a spending mindset. So they work very hard to save their money, and they've got this lovely pot of money. And then, I've done huge amounts of research and talked about this a lot, but significantly, there are so many retirees that are underspending, chronically underspending, because they're fearful of so many of these unknown outcomes. And so I suppose my comment around this, I'm just going to get your thought. As we struggle with identity, structure, purpose, and power, and the fact that it is a loss phase, right? We are losing a number of those things intentionally, but we're moving that away. Is there a problem with kind of work spoon feeding us a lot of this stuff for so many years, right? And you mentioned this deep, work that people have to do. Well, actually, you're approaching your, let's say 60th birthday, and you're being asked to do this stuff for the first time. You've never really had to do that deep work. Why am I who I am? Who do I want to be? And what do I want to do? Because work has somewhat spoon-fed us a lot of our structure and our purpose and our identity. Because when someone says, who are we? We give them their business card. We give them our business card, right? That kind of thing. Is that your experience? Is that kind of what you're kind of getting at when it kind of thinks about this transition from work and losing that stuff?
Well, again, I would come back and say, Dan, that people expect, generally speaking, in my experience, they expect that they are going to be able to coast through retirement. They've done the hard work, they've done the heavy lifting, and now it's coasting time. And that may be the case in phase 1. But it certainly is not the case in subsequent phases. And the phase 1 will probably be the shortest part of one's retirement, 2 years out of maybe 30. So yes, they have been spoon-fed, and that there's hard work and heavy lifting to be done in retirement as well. And many people just don't get that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And it comes back to the 3Ds that you talked about, and you mentioned a stat around divorce. There's a stat in the UK that I come across last year, and since 1990, 9% of all divorces were by people aged 60 and over. It's now 40% of all divorces in the UK are by people's aged 60 and over, effectively. And I think, again, it's kind of, if you think about how important relationships are, which is one of those key 5 things, and we know the Harvard study has given us wonderful data about the importance of relationships on a long, happy life. Well, I don't think enough couples do enough work together, because the dynamic of that relationship is going to significantly change, over that period. And I just see so much sleepwalking into this, thinking everything's going to be the same, but it's not the same, because you're now going to spend a lot of time together, and typically you've probably got on quite well because you haven't spent so much time together. And we see that a lot, right?
There was one lady that I interviewed, and she put it pretty succinctly. She said, retirement is double the time together and half the income.
Yeah, which might not create the joy that she was thinking it might create, right? I mean, that's kind of, yeah. Look, I think it's a huge challenge, and I've done a bit of work around, and I know some others have, about how this particular phase, actually thinking about it, is very much like the grieving process, right? You look at the Kubler-Ross change curve of
Absolutely.
grief, that the loss that you feel in this phase is very much like the loss that you feel and the emotions you go through when you grieve, through that, right?
Yes. In fact, her work really helped me to try to capsulize or to kind of develop a framework that might be helpful. And certainly, I'm aware of the phases that she describes. And yes, there are similarities here.
Mm. So we're now kind of into the, and as you said, at the deepest, was the deepest floor of the curve of the phases. This is depressive, right? This is depressive stuff. And as you said, I've come across that stat before, which is actually quite startling, worth repeating. You are 40% more likely to be depressed or show depressive characteristics in retirement than if you're not in retirement. That stat alone should get people and wake it up and give them a kick in the backside. Just think about what this is doing, right? So we're starting to come out of that and think about trial and error. I call it the reason to pull back the duvet in the morning. What is your reason to get out of bed? Again, with work, whether you've liked it or not, you've had a reason to get out of bed. You now need to manufacture that reason to get out of bed and pull back the duvet. But not only that, Riley, I think you need to not just do it just for the sake of it, right? I.e., this needs to be something that brings you some joy and some purpose. You need to get out of bed and have that.
Absolutely. And that's where the service to others comes as the common theme for those in phase 4. When we provide service to others, not only do we do that, but we in effect provide service to ourselves. It makes us feel better when we help other people. It's just about as basic a human consideration as one can get. And the other thing about the phase 4 people is that most of them tend to be near the very top of Maslow's hierarchy, where they're achieving their full potential, and they're giving to something that's larger than themselves, and there's something intrinsically valuable about doing that. And again, that seems to come with those successful phase 4 people who are looking. They've got a kind of an electric buzz about them. I find they can't wait for the sun to rise. They can't wait to throw off the duvet and get at whatever it is they're going to get at.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. If I think about the words that you've used in these two phases, so think about phase 3, the trial and error phase, and you've mentioned some of your own experiences with that. And you mentioned the word failure, which I think is really important. I do think in the work that I've done with people, there is this real, I don't know what it is, but this I don't know, they lose their ability to be curious. People lose their ability to feel like they can explore, and they lose their ability, and I think they've got a real big fear of failure in general, right? I think maybe it might come from a fact, well, I'm aged 55, 60, 62, whatever it is. I've been through my career. I should be wise and knowledgeable. That I shouldn't fail at this stuff. I should know what it is. So I don't think people put themselves out there to fail. That growth mindset of, let's try something, and if it doesn't work, I'll quit and I'll go try something else.
Exactly.
Do you, in your mind, and I use these three words a lot with people I work with, exploration, being curious, and failing to grow, do you see that as a good trait for people that move through this, and a trait that people don't actually demonstrate, and they get stuck in having those particular kind of fears and characteristics?
Absolutely. And the good news is that people who are able to do those things that you've just described are much more likely to break through to phase 4. Those who don't are much more likely to spin their wheels, to become frustrated, even depressed, and to fall back into phase 2, which and become part of the statistics.
Yeah. So, Riley, stage 4 then, if we think about the two words that you've used, which I think are really important, the reinvent and rewire, the phase of this. I think, as you've said, right, this is the deeply fulfilling bit. You've mentioned a statistic that, 60 odd % of people that you work with, get to this. So my hope is that we can together and with other people, get more people kind of in this phase of life. I
Exactly.
think one of the misconceptions that I see, and you did mention this earlier on, one of the misconceptions I see is that people take those two words, maybe, or others, reinvent and rewire, and they create and manifest something bigger in their head than it needs to be. And you mentioned the word simple things, right? The happiest retirees have reinvented and rewired themselves, found out what brought them joy and happiness. And by the way, typically it's quite simple, joyful things. It's giving back, it's volunteering, it's going for a Sunday lunch with their wife or husband, not worrying about emails on the Monday morning or the commute. It's time walking the dog, it's more time in the gym. Like, yeah, there are holidays and there is travel, and you might do a couple of beach walks, whatever that might be. But I think for most people, deeply fulfilling second half of life, third acts, retirement is often more simpler than what it is, because the people that do the deep introspective work in here find that what brings them fulfillment and joy is actually the more simpler things around relationships and stuff like that. Is that your experience?
Yes, it is. It is absolutely my experience, Dan, and you said it extremely well. It is the simpler things. It is not generally complicated. It's as you say, it's the simpler things that just provide them an opportunity to provide service for others, which brings joy to them.
Yeah. I think that's a key takeaway for me, right? I think that's, anyone listening that, thinks, yeah, listen, there might be some sort of bucket list and there might be some things you absolutely want to do. And now freedom and time is on your side, but they are the things that are the exceptions, right? And as someone said to me, I interviewed a client on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he said, they're the easy things to plan for. The hard things is what everyday life looks like, and they're the things that actually I need to figure out what brings me joy in everyday life. I might do a really good holiday once a year for 3 weeks, but there are 49 other weeks to sort out here.
Yeah. Well, the bucket list things are typically associated with phase one, the vacation phase, where people quite aggressively, in some cases, kind of tick off some of the things that that list that they've developed over a period of time. And it's true and travel is particularly popular in phase one. But as you say, travel is something that I see people in virtually all phases still continuing to do as long.
Yeah. So as we kind of move towards the end of this conversation, and as I said, I think we could have several more about this, and and just such wonderful stuff. If we think about those, practical steps, I think we've now established in the work that you've done and the millions of people that you've done it to, and the few people that I get to through the work that I do, we've established that retirement is a human challenge. It's a psychological challenge. What are some practical steps do you think that people can feel like they're doing to help them set new aspirations, maybe engage in learning and building these new social networks that are so important to them?
Well, I come back to some of the things that I've suggested are critical previously. I think it's really important that we know the things that we love to do and do really well. Everyone has them. I've just found that people generally don't think about them. And they need to, because that's going to provide them fuel to move to phase four. I think it's also critically important that people identify and recognize that they have had some successes in the past, and that those successes can be replicated, perhaps in a different environment than they were created originally, perhaps in an entirely different environment. But that doesn't matter. If we take our strengths and we realize that they have led to success in the past, there's a very good chance that applied perhaps in different areas, they're going to lead to success and happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction in the future as well.
Riley, I think that's a wonderful place to kind of leave this conversation and end it there, because it was such profound advice and wisdom. Listen, I can't thank you enough for joining me today and taking time out of your busy schedule to come and have this conversation with me. I hope we get to have many more conversations going forward, and I do plan to come out to Toronto to see some friends. So you might get me knocking at your door.
That would be
You can
lovely.
tell me to go away, but you might get me.
No, not at all. Not at all. That'd be lovely. And I
And
appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work that I've done with your wider audience. Every every opportunity that I have to share some of my findings is an opportunity that I appreciate. So thank you.
listen, it's been so good. And obviously, without saying, links to the TED Talk. I can't believe that any of my listeners may not have seen this, right? But just in case you haven't watched it, it's the best 18 odd minutes that you're going to listen to. Some very funny great stories in there as well, Riley. Some amazing stuff that you say, and obviously the links to your book and the workshops, etc., that you do that extend this work that you're doing in a bit more detail will be in the show notes. So, thank you once again for joining me and taking time out.
My pleasure, Dan. Bye for now.
And that just leaves me to thank everyone for joining me on the Humans versus Retirement podcast. Until next time, take care.